I walked into Dr. Mara Voss's office on a Tuesday in February with a shoulder injury from a weekend basketball game and walked out 40 minutes later having absolutely no memory of what she had said about my shoulder. I remembered everything else. The way she sat across the examination table from me with her honey blonde hair pinned loosely and her amber eyes reading the file in her hand. Not performing reading, actually reading. Her brow just slightly furrowed, completely present in the way that some people are completely present and most people only approximate. The way she asked questions and then waited for the full answer before asking the next one. The way she explained what was happening with my shoulder in language that assumed I was intelligent rather than fragile. I sat on that examination table in her Michigan Avenue office on a Tuesday in February and thought, for the first time about anyone in recent memory, that I would like to know this person. Not in the way you think that about a doctor, in the other way. She said I would need to come back in 2 weeks for a follow-up. I said, of course, without hesitation, with a speed that probably told her everything I was not saying. She scheduled the appointment without looking up from her notes. I left her office and stood on Michigan Avenue in the February cold and understood that I was in considerable trouble. This is the story of what I did about it.
The practice was on the 14th floor of a building on Michigan Avenue, with windows that looked south toward the lake. And on a gray February Tuesday, the city below was the particular muted version of itself that only winter produced. Everything slightly softened, the usual sharp edges of Chicago gone quiet under cloud. I had been given Dr. Voss as my physician by a friend who described her only as extremely good, which turned out to be an understatement of some significance. She came into the examination room without the performance that some doctors bring, the deliberate authority, the practiced warmth, and simply introduced herself and sat down and opened the file and began reading it with complete attention. She was wearing a white coat over a deep navy blouse, and her honey blonde hair was pinned loosely at the back of her neck, with strands falling around her face. And she had the particular quality of someone who was entirely comfortable in their own competence. She asked about the injury with precision, not the checklist questions, but the ones that actually built a picture, and listened to my answers the way people rarely listened, without already forming the next question while I was still finishing the current one. At one point, she looked up from the file directly at me to ask something, and her amber eyes were so straightforwardly present that I lost the thread of what I'd been saying for a half-second before recovering. She noticed. I know she noticed because the corner of her mouth moved slightly, not a smile, just the acknowledgement of something, before she looked back at the file. I left with a treatment plan I could not have repeated, and an appointment in 2 weeks that I had agreed to with more enthusiasm than a shoulder injury strictly warranted.
The 2 weeks between the first appointment and the follow-up were educational in a way I had not anticipated. I discovered that I thought about Dr. Mara Voss at completely unpredictable intervals throughout the day, while making coffee, while working, while running along the lakefront path in the cold, which I did more than usual in those 2 weeks because running was one of the few activities that required enough physical attention to temporarily displace the thinking. I thought about her amber eyes and the way she had asked questions and the half-second of something when she had looked up from the file. I thought about the corner of her mouth. I also thought, repeatedly and with genuine effort, about all the reasons this line of thought was not productive. She was my doctor. She was at least 15 years older than me. The power differential in a medical relationship was not trivial. These were real considerations, and I took them seriously. They didn't help. By the time the follow-up appointment arrived, I had rehearsed being completely normal so many times that I walked into her office on a Thursday morning feeling less normal than I'd felt at any point in recent memory. She came in, sat down, asked how the shoulder had been, and the rehearsed normalcy evaporated immediately because she was actually asking, actually listening, and the answer that came out of my mouth was more honest than the one I had prepared. She looked up. I looked back. The shoulder, as it turned out, was fine.
The third appointment was technically unnecessary. My shoulder had been responding well to the treatment plan. The exercises she had given me were straightforward, and I had been doing them consistently, partially because the shoulder needed it, and partially because doing them meant I was following her instructions, and there was something in that I was not ready to examine too closely. I came to the appointment anyway. She knew it was unnecessary. I could tell she knew from the moment she looked at the notes and then at me with those amber eyes that processed information faster than most people I had met. She asked the standard questions. I gave the standard answers. The shoulder was improving exactly as expected. Then she set down the file and looked at me directly and asked how I was sleeping. Not a standard question, not on any clinical checklist. I said, fine. Then I said, actually not that well. Then I said I wasn't sure why, which was not entirely true. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said that disrupted sleep was sometimes a response to an unresolved decision, that the mind continued working on something the person had not yet consciously addressed. She said it clinically, professionally, looking at her notes while she said it. But her pen had stopped moving, and the room was very quiet. I said I thought she was probably right about that. She looked up. We held that for a moment, the clinical language around something that was not clinical at all. And then she made a note in the file and said she would see me in 2 weeks, and stood up and I stood up and we said goodbye, with the particular care of two people who have just had a conversation that they are both going to think about for the next 2 weeks. I did not sleep well that night either.
The coffee shop was 3 buildings north of the practice, and I had no legitimate reason to be in it on a Thursday morning in March, except that I had arrived early for my appointment and needed somewhere to wait, and it was the closest option. I was reading something on my phone when she came through the door. She was not in her white coat. Dark trousers, a camel wool coat, her honey blonde hair loose around her shoulders for the first time. Not the professional version, but the actual version. And she ordered without looking at the menu the way people ordered at places they came to regularly. She turned from the counter and saw me. Something moved across her expression. Surprise, and then something that settled into something else, and she crossed to where I was sitting and said, "Good morning," in the tone of someone deciding how to calibrate a moment they had not planned for. I stood up, which was unnecessary, and then felt self-conscious about having stood up, and she sat down across from me with her coffee and looked at me with those amber eyes and said, "I seem to keep running into you." We had 40 minutes before my appointment. We spent all 40 of them talking, and the conversation went further and faster than 40 minutes of coffee with a near stranger should have gone. And when we walked back to the practice together, I was aware that something had shifted in the architecture of whatever this was. She became my doctor again the moment we walked through the practice door. But the 40 minutes had happened, and neither of us had left early.
She was 38 years old. I found out gradually through the small details that surface in repeated conversations. A comment about a conference she had attended 10 years earlier, a reference to where she had done her residency, the particular self-possession of someone who had spent a decade and a half building something real and knew the weight of what it had cost. She had been divorced for 2 years. She mentioned it once in the coffee shop, not as a wound, but as a fact. A marriage that had been the right decision at the time and had slowly stopped being one, handled by 2 reasonable adults who had eventually acknowledged what was true. She was not looking for anything. She said that too, directly, in the way she said everything, without performance, without asking me to handle it carefully. She was the most self-possessed person I had encountered in 23 years of encountering people. She was also, in the moments when the professional composure gave way slightly, in the coffee shop, in the chance encounters that began happening with a frequency that neither of us could entirely attribute to coincidence, something more than self-possessed. Warm and occasionally funny, and capable of a directness about the world that made every other conversation I had feel slightly approximate by comparison. I came to my appointments, I did my shoulder exercises, I was a completely appropriate and professional patient. And I thought about her constantly.
I did not expect to see her at the Urban Planning Conference. The event was at a hotel on Wacker Drive, a 2-day professional conference I attended every year. Nothing remarkable about it, and I was crossing the lobby on the first evening, heading toward the reception, when I saw her near the entrance, still in her coat, looking at her phone with the focused expression she brought to everything. She was there for a medical panel on urban health infrastructure. I was there for architecture and city planning. The overlap was a single shared reception in the hotel ballroom which neither of us had known about in advance, and which now seemed, standing in the lobby, recognizing each other across it, less like a coincidence and more like something the city had arranged. She saw me at the same moment I saw her. The expression that moved across her face was brief and real, and told me more than any of our careful professional appointments had told me. She crossed the lobby, I met her halfway. We stood in the hotel lobby with professional Chicago moving around us and talked for 20 minutes that were supposed to be the walk to the reception and became something else entirely. About the conference, about work, about nothing that mattered and everything that did. At some point, someone from her panel stopped to say hello, and she introduced me, not as her patient, not by title, just my name and my firm, and something about hearing my name in her voice in a different context than the examination room settled into my chest in a way I felt for the rest of the evening. We went to the reception separately. We were professional throughout. We said goodnight in the lobby at the end of the evening with other people around us. She was already in the elevator when she turned and looked at me one last time before the doors closed. I stood in the lobby and thought about that look all the way home.
It was her idea, which I did not expect. She texted, she had my number for appointment reminders, on a Saturday morning in April and said she was walking the lakefront path and asked if I wanted to join her. In the particular way she said everything, direct and without excessive qualification. I said yes immediately and then spent 20 minutes finding something to wear that was appropriate for walking the lakefront path and did not indicate that I had spent 20 minutes finding something to wear. She was already on the path when I arrived, her honey blonde hair loose in the April wind off the lake, a dark-fitted running jacket, and she looked entirely at ease in a way that made my rehearsed casualness feel unnecessary. We walked for 2 hours, not fast, stopping occasionally to look at the lake or the skyline, the conversation moving through things that had nothing to do with medicine or appointments. Her practice, my work in the architecture firm where I had recently started, the city in April, which was a completely different city than the February one where this had begun. At one point, she said something about the lake that was unexpectedly poetic, and then looked slightly surprised at herself for having said it. I looked at her profile in the April light, her eyes on the water, a strand of hair across her face from the wind, and felt something so clear and uncomplicated that I had to look at the lake instead. When we said goodbye on the path, she touched my arm briefly, casual, warm, the kind of contact that was entirely appropriate and that I thought about for the rest of the day.
She chose the restaurant, a small Italian place in Lincoln Square that she had been coming to for years, and I arrived early and was already seated when she came through the door in a deep burgundy dress that was elegant and understated and stopped my thought completely for a half second. She sat down across from me and ordered wine with the ease of someone entirely comfortable in her own choices, and looked at me across the candlelit table and said, "We should probably acknowledge what this is." I said, "Yes, we probably should." She looked at her wine glass for a moment, then at me. She said she was aware of the complexity, the age difference, 15 years, she said it directly, the professional relationship, which she had already begun transferring to a colleague because she had known, she said, since the coffee shop in March, that continuing as my physician was not a position either of them could sustain honestly. I sat with all of that for a moment. Then I told her that I had been thinking about her since the first appointment, that I had extended my treatment plan in my own mind well beyond medical necessity, and that the 20 minutes I had spent deciding what to wear for the lakefront walk was probably the clearest evidence I could offer of where things stood. She looked at me across the candlelit table for a long moment. Then she laughed, genuinely, with her whole face, the laugh I had seen in the coffee shop and on the lakefront path, and said that she had also spent 20 minutes deciding what to wear for the lakefront walk. The snow came down outside the Lincoln Square restaurant, and the candle burned between us, and we had dinner and talked until the restaurant was nearly empty.
We stood on the street outside the restaurant in the late April snow, which was the kind of thing Chicago did occasionally, a final reminder of winter at the moment spring seemed settled. And she looked at me with those amber eyes that had been doing something since February, and said she needed to be honest about something. She said she did not know how to do this in a way that was uncomplicated. She was 38 and had a practice and a life that was entirely constructed around who she was and what she had built, and she had spent 2 years being entirely fine on her own and had not been looking for anything to disrupt that. I said I understood. She said she also could not pretend that the lakefront walk and the dinner and the coffee shop and the first appointment had been nothing, because they had not been nothing for her, and she did not think they had been nothing for me. I said they had not been nothing for me. The snow fell between us on the quiet Lincoln Square street. She looked at me for a long moment with an expression I had not seen from her before. Not the doctor, not the self-possessed woman entirely comfortable in her competence, but someone slightly at the edge of something uncertain, which made her more real to me than anything that had come before. Then she reached out and took my hand. Just that. Just her hand in mine on the snowy street. And we stood there while Chicago went quiet around us, and I understood that whatever came next was going to be real and complicated and entirely worth it.
There was a week in May that was harder than the others. Not between us. Between us, things had been honest since the Lincoln Square dinner and the snowy street and her hand in mine, and honesty made things easier even when the things themselves were complicated. The difficulty came from outside that honesty, from the world that surrounded it and had opinions about it. A colleague of hers called her after seeing us together at the conference hotel, not hostile, curious, in the way colleagues were curious about things that didn't concern them. She told me about the call matter-of-factly, sitting in my apartment on a rainy May evening with a cup of tea, her coat still on because she had come straight from the practice. She was not upset about the call. She was clear in the way she was always clear. What other people thought of her choices was information she considered and then made her own decision about, and she had made her decision. What made the week difficult was watching her carry something she had not signed up to carry, the discretion required, the careful navigation of a professional world where her personal life had become, briefly, a subject of interest. She handled it without complaint and without drama and without asking me to feel responsible for it. I felt responsible for it anyway. I told her that on the rainy May evening, and she looked at me across the apartment and said something I have not forgotten. She said, "I made a choice, not you. I made a choice because I wanted to, and I don't take back choices I make with clear eyes." The rain came down on Lincoln Park outside the window. I looked at her on my couch in her coat with her tea and understood that she was the most honest person I had known, and that honesty, in a person, was its own kind of beauty.
What followed was not simple, and I want to be honest about that. Her colleagues noticed. Not dramatically, she was a private person and handled her life with discretion, but in a practice where everyone knew everyone, the fact of a new person in her life filtered through eventually. My friends had opinions, which they expressed with varying degrees of tact. The age difference was the thing they returned to most. I listened to all of it and said very little, which was my way of acknowledging that I had heard them without agreeing that it changed anything. She handled the complexity with the same directness she brought to everything, clearly, without apology, without asking anyone to be comfortable with it before they were ready. She did not perform being fine with the complications. She actually was, because she had thought about them carefully before deciding anything. We found a rhythm in the spring. the lakefront on Saturday mornings, dinner on Friday evenings that sometimes ended with me still there Sunday morning making coffee in her kitchen, learning where she kept things not because she told me to, but because I paid attention the way she had taught me to pay attention. She was the most complete person I had ever been close to. Not perfect, she was impatient occasionally, and occasionally too self-sufficient in ways that made it difficult to help her. But complete. Someone who had built herself honestly over 38 years and knew exactly what she was. Being known by her was different from being known by anyone else.
Her apartment was on the north side of the city, Andersonville, a neighborhood that suited her in the particular way that some neighborhoods suit some people, unpretentious and warm and full of good independent bookshops. And on a Saturday morning in late May, I woke up in the particular quiet of her apartment and lay still for a moment, listening to her in the kitchen. The sounds of a morning, coffee being made, something being said on the counter, a brief quiet that might have been her reading something on her phone, were so ordinary and so entirely hers that I lay there longer than I needed to, simply to be in them. When I came out, she was at the kitchen counter in a white-fitted t-shirt and dark joggers, her hunch blonde hair loose and slightly tangled from sleep, no makeup, entirely herself in the way that only a person's own kitchen on a Saturday morning revealed. She looked up, poured a second cup of coffee without asking, set it on the counter beside her. I came and stood beside her, and she handed me the cup, and we stood at her kitchen window looking out at Andersonville below, the Saturday morning street beginning its weekend, a few people walking dogs, the neighborhood unhurried and warm. She said something about a patient she was concerned about. I said something about a project I was struggling with. We talked in the easy, overlapping way of people who have learned each other's conversational rhythm. At one point, she leaned into me slightly, not dramatically, just the small, unconscious lean of someone at ease. And I put my arm around her, and she stayed there. And we looked at the Saturday street below, and the May sun came through the kitchen window, and I thought, this is it, this specific thing. This kitchen, and this coffee, and this woman leaning into me on a Saturday morning in Andersonville. This is the whole point of everything.
On a Saturday in May, she said something that I have thought about since. We were on the lakefront path, the lake blue for the first time after months of gray, the city bright behind us, spring finally meaning it. And she had been quiet for a while, in the comfortable way she was sometimes quiet, which I had learned to simply be in rather than fill. She said, I spent a long time being good at being alone. Not lonely, just building something that didn't require anyone else to be complete. I said, I knew. I could see that in her. She said, you make me want to be less alone. Not because you fill something that was empty, because you make the thing I built feel larger with you in it. I walked beside her on the lakefront path and felt something move through me that I did not have words for and did not need words for. She took my hand without looking at me. I held on. The lake was blue and the city was bright, and May in Chicago was the best version of everything. And I understood walking beside her that the shoulder injury and the February appointment and the 40 minutes in the coffee shop and the snowy Lincoln Square street had all been the particular long way around to this, to a Saturday morning in May when the lake was finally blue and I was exactly where I was supposed to be.
June arrived, and Chicago became the city it spent the rest of the year promising to be. Warm, open, the lake reflecting everything, the skyline clean against the summer sky. We walked the lakefront path on a Saturday evening, and the light was going gold across the water, and she had her hand in mine, and her honey blonde hair loose in the lake breeze, and I thought about a Tuesday in February, and a gray Michigan Avenue, and a 14-floor examination room, and the moment I had walked out onto the street, knowing I was in considerable trouble. I had been right about the trouble. I had been wrong about whether it was the kind worth avoiding. She said something about the light on the water, and I agreed, and we walked in the comfortable quiet of two people who had found their frequency and were not in a hurry anymore. The city moved behind us, and the path stretched ahead, and the lake went gold, and then rose, and then the particular deep blue of a Chicago summer evening. I was 23 years old, and I was in love with my former doctor, and the lake was golden,
And none of the complicated things had disappeared, but all of them had become manageable in the way that complicated things become manageable when you are carrying them with someone who is honest and present and entirely real. She leaned into me slightly as we walked. I put my arm around her. Chicago held us both in the June evening light, and the lakefront path went on ahead of us, long and open, for as far as either of us could see.